you have any regrets when you look back on your life?
It's not every day that people can look to the past to ascertain their future. But when it comes to Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, they needn't look too far behind to see that where they are headed isn't exactly a great place to be. Alone, isolated, mocked and reviled, walking and talking bejeweled, grinning caricatures that are so remote from anything royal. Even their titles have lost all meaning.
Duchess of Sussex is hard to say. Duchess of Sussex. Duchess of Sussex.
Other than being seen for what they truly are, a farce, a money grab, and a desperate attempt at clinging to any remaining vestiges of royalty that they once enjoyed. Gone are the glory days of the Duke and Duchess of Misery, sitting in what looked like the Garden of Eden in the midst of a pandemic, with the ink barely dry on their multi-million-dollar contracts, spinning the very lies that would lead to their rapid fall from grace. But the high, precariously balanced on a house of cards as it was, didn't last long, and soon the couple's California dream turned into a global nightmare, for they have committed the cardinal sin of not only vastly overestimating their own abilities, but equally underestimating their dignified and self-proclaimed enemy. Say what you want about the British royal family, but the way that they've handled Meghan and Harry these past few years is nothing short of masterful. You want to set up and commercialize a rival court? Well, too bad. Sussex Royal is getting shut down before it even takes off. Half in, half out? We'll do you one better and strip you of everything altogether. After a very kind and entirely undeserved 12-month review period, that is. Unfounded allegations on Oprah while Prince Philip was on his deathbed? How about the world finds out about Meghan's alleged bullying of her staff only a few days prior to that interview? And as for the demands for public apologies and balcony appearances, how about no? With an encore of booing from the public as the proverbial cherry on top. But like spoiled brats, they thought they could weasel their way back into Daddy and Willie's good graces after an entire career built upon destroying them and their loved ones. A career that only came to a halt because of its spectacular failure. And even then, can we honestly say it came to a halt? Because for all their public proclamations of moving on and leaving the royal feud behind them, they still have their mouthpieces. What was Omid Scobie's royal racist leak last November, if not a direct retaliation for not getting the much coveted and hinted at invitation to Christmas at Sandringham last year? Or how about the countless staged pap shots of Meghan every time she feels overshadowed by the royals, including their little children? To say that their behavior over the past few years has been ill thought out, confounding, and outright vulgar would be a vast understatement. And with their short reputations, extravagant lifestyle, and meaningless existence, one can't help but wonder, to what end? What did they think would happen when they set off on their, quote, freedom flight in 2020? That they would sign a couple of contracts and lie on Oprah and that would be it? That they'd be all set up to not only compete with, but destroy and replace a 1,000-year-old institution? One that has survived centuries of actual wars, including 2 world wars? If they did, well then they have been sadly mistaken. Because, as we shall see, the royal family has had a lot of practice. It's an age-old saying, there is no greater danger than underestimating your opponent. A saying that Meghan Markle and Prince Harry clearly hadn't heard of. Because before they came along, the royals had another set of troublesome exiles to contend with, and I think we all know who prevailed. Like Meghan and Harry, Edward and Wallis led a meaningless, yet equally extravagant existence, running their own faux royal household in France, complete with curtsies and bowing and monogrammed everything, freeloading off their richer friends and acquaintances, and throwing party after party to drown out their sorrows and regrets in a vapid social life that could only sustain them for so long. As Andrew Loney put it in The Traitor King, without any purpose in life, the Windsors' purpose became to entertain and be entertained. And as the old saying goes, an idle mind is the devil's playground. You see, the Windsors, in an attempt to make money and to stick it to the royal family, much like Meghan and Harry, wrote memoirs, made a documentary based on Edward's memoir, and issued thinly veiled threats to expose the royals if they didn't get their way. For instance, in 1946, Edward threatened to publicly air his grievances with the royals after a dispute involving a property he coveted called Fort Belvedere, which he wanted to purchase but wasn't allowed to. The MI5 and the government decided to take the risk and to just let him try, confident that anything he would say would, quote, cut no ice with the press. Wallace and Edward also wrote magazine columns about fashion and entertaining because that's really all they did. At one point, Wallace, in her monthly column in McCall's magazine, ghostwritten by journalist Etta Wanger, even complained about the royal feud, writing, "My husband has been punished like a small boy who gets a spanking every day of his life for a single transgression. His hurt has been deep." I mean, I don't know about you, but potential treason during wartime sounds a little bit more than just a simple transgression, but maybe that's just me. Edward himself publicly weighed in on the feud when, for the 30th anniversary of his abdication in 1966, he wrote a series of newspaper articles about his life from 1936 onwards. Now, of course, all of this didn't go down too well with the royals, but staying true to their motto of never complain, never explain, they ignored the Windsors' games, maintaining a silent dignity that is not at all dissimilar to the attitude that they employ with the Sussexes today. After Edward resigned from his post in the Bahamas at the conclusion of World War II, his brother the King, in a telegram to Churchill marked strictly private and personal, wrote, "In any discussion as to his future, perhaps you would put forward my conviction, which you already know, namely that his happiness will be best promoted by making his home in the USA. Repeat, USA." Sounds an awful lot like William's attitude towards the middle-aged toddlers today, doesn't it? And also a similar sentiment was expressed by King Charles in his inaugural speech as king when he wished Meghan and Harry well in building their life overseas. By the way, when it comes to Edward and Wallace, they ended up living in France because of the tax breaks that were given to them by the French. You see, like Meghan and Harry, they were both incredibly stingy with their money, despite drowning in it. Now, there might be a slight difference in attitude towards Edward in comparison to how the royal family sees Harry today. Because apart from his brother the King, the rest of the royal family didn't seem to have an issue with seeing Edward himself. In fact, Edward and his mother wrote to each other frequently, and his mother, Queen Mary, seemed to love him very much, despite everything that happened. But it was his wife whom they collectively despised, seeing as they blamed her for all of the chaos that had transpired since Edward met her. But I'll leave the details of how the family treated Wallace for a different video in this series. Basically, for the rest of their lives, the relationship between the Windsors and the royals would see very little improvement, most of which took place after Queen Elizabeth II assumed the throne after her father's untimely death. Deaths in the family didn't do much to bring them together either, which is another unfortunate parallel between the couples. Although, unlike Meghan, Wallace was not invited to Queen Mary's funeral or even King George VI's funeral, so Edward had to go by himself, wearing the uniform of the Admiral of the Fleet to his brother's funeral, which drew criticism and reminded me actually of the criticism that Harry drew when he insisted on wearing his uniform at the vigil for the Queen right before her funeral. Speaking of the late Queen, Edward and Wallace also weren't invited to her wedding, nor were they invited to her coronation. Even when the Queen did make nice with them, it was mostly for optics, at least initially in the 50s, when she was still a newly minted and very young monarch. Eventually, though, as time went on and as Edward and Wallace approached the end of their lives, things did finally start to thaw out. The couple were invited to attend the dedication of a plaque outside Marlborough House to commemorate Queen Mary, where Wallace and the Queen Mother finally met for the first time since 1936. But outside of these rare displays of public unity, Edward and Wallis were still ostracized, living alone in their stately French home, continuing the sad charade that had dominated their lives together, despite their best efforts to convince the world otherwise.
We've been very happy.
That's right.
Because behind the curtains, a very different story played out. A young Prince Charles himself remarked on the sad state of their lives in his diary after an unexpected visit to their home in France in 1970, writing that, quote, "The whole thing seemed so tragic, and he just couldn't leave fast enough." Ghostwriter Charles Murphy, who wrote both Edward and Wallis's memoirs, also remarked to his co-writer, "How pitiable it all is. They are quite alone among comparative strangers. The lady made it so. Whatever court there was, she was determined to rule. And now it is made up mostly of shadows." And doesn't the lady he referred to sound identical to Meghan Markle? If a journalist wrote that about her today, wouldn't it be so fitting? In 1972, Edward was close to death, and Wallis had already started developing early stage Alzheimer's since at least 1971, I believe. So her mental state was deteriorating before the Duke died. The Queen visited Edward one last time shortly before his death, which was brought about by throat cancer. And Wallis was flown out to the UK for the funeral, where she stayed with the royals before returning to France alone, confused due to her advancing Alzheimer's, and feeling utterly lost without Edward, by all accounts, including Prince Charles's description of her at the funeral. Upon her return, she ensured that their entire house was kept as a shrine to Edward. All of his belongings were untouched and laid out as though he was still there, ready to get dressed and write a letter at his desk at any moment. Also, before I move on from the topic of Edward's death, I thought I might shed some more light into the very popular myths surrounding that time period. Now, according to the night nurse, Wallis never visited Edward when he was sick. And it was very sad because he kept calling out for her, etc., etc. I think we've all heard that story. However, as I mentioned, she was dealing with her own very serious health issues at that point. But also, when it comes to his death, two versions of what happened exist. The first, which Wallis recounted to a friend and is corroborated by a nurse, is that Wallis was woken up at night to see Edward one last time before he passed, and she held him in her arms, told him how lovely he looked, to which he responded with, "Darling," before dying in her arms. Now, I know this sounds very fantastical and story-like, and it may not be true, but it was corroborated by a nurse. So whether she was paid off, whether there was some deal there, we'll never know. The other version, which is the more popular one and the one that we've all heard, was given by their secretary, John Utter, who claimed that Wallis wasn't even awake when Edward passed and that he, John, had to wake her to let her know. So yeah, I guess let me know in the comments which version you believe, because we really don't have a definitive way of finding out. Wallis's end was a very slow and tragic one. She gradually lost her faculties and eventually started getting scammed by her own lawyer, Suzanne Blum, who appointed herself as the sole manager of Wallis's estate and started selling things and giving them to friends and to herself right under Wallis's nose. It's also worth noting that the Queen Mother, her arch nemesis for so long, tried to see her in 1976, but Wallis was too ill to receive her. And so the Queen Mother sent her roses with a little message that said, "In friendship, Elizabeth," signaling that the lifelong feud was finally over. Wallis eventually died on the 24th of April, 1986, 14 years after losing Edward, and not too far off her 90th birthday. A small funeral was held, attended by the royal family, including Princess Diana, at St. George's Chapel, which you might remember as being the venue for Meghan and Harry's wedding 32 years later. So, with a recounting of Wallis and Edward's story, I'm sure I'm not the only one who feels as though I'm looking at the future for Meghan and Harry if they continue along this trajectory. But as tragic as this lonely existence was it meaningless? Or does it simply appear to be meaningless to us, but satisfactory to the likes of vapid people such as Meghan Markle and Prince Harry? Is it actually a cautionary tale of what is to come? Or is it exactly the sort of meretricious life that they wish to lead? Edward, at least, despite once remarking that he would have reigned 36 years in 1972 had he not abdicated, which indicates at least a hint of regret, seemed otherwise adamant that he made the right choice in leaving everything behind for Wallis, telling a friend months before his death, "I've spent the better part of my life with her, and I can tell you that nothing I gave up for her equals what she has given me. Happiness, of course, but also meaning. I have found her to be utterly without faults, the perfect woman." Wallis, on the other hand, didn't shy away from admitting to having regrets.
Oh, about certain things, yes, I wish it could have been different.
And considering the whole backstory of their marriage, which we discussed in great detail in an older video I made called The Original, I think it's safe to say that unlike Edward, she did feel trapped, and as a result, seemed to have openly resented her husband for it, at least for a time. As for Meghan and Harry, well, firstly, I don't see them ever admitting to having any regrets, despite how they may actually feel. We've seen over the past 8 years how there's always a scapegoat, always someone else to blame for their predicament. Even most recently, after having the gall to tell ITV that his family has been suffering from press intrusion while his wife constantly calls the paps on herself, Harry blamed his war against the press for being at least partially responsible for the rift that he has with his family. Because the press forced you both to attack your family on Oprah and in Spare and for 6 hours on Netflix, right? In any case, while he may never openly admit it, I have no doubt that one day, Harry in particular will regret the path that he chose, if he doesn't already. Because unlike Harry, who chose to do this, Edward never wanted the lifelong exile imposed upon him, even if he was instrumental in causing it. He was given an ultimatum. It was either his kingdom or his wife. And he chose the option that he valued the most. When you look at Meghan and Harry, however, while he may love her as much as Edward loved Wallis, no one put a proverbial gun to his head and made him choose. She was not only welcomed into the royal fold, but was celebrated, with everyone around her bending over backwards to make her happy. And still, they chose to excommunicate themselves, if the official Megxit story is to be believed, and assuming they weren't actually forced out for an undisclosed reason. And they probably thought, as Wallis and Edward once did, that they could outshine the royals by trading off their fringe royal status and actually remain relevant for the rest of their lives. When the reality is, the world has always been all about out with the old and in with the new. And in this instance, the new generation of royals is right on the horizon. A few more years, and the Wales children will be teenagers, dominating the headlines, whether they like it or not. And Meghan and Harry will be old news, bitter and forgotten, merely a footnote in history, only remembered for all the hurt and damage that they have caused, just like Edward and Wallis before them. And that's it. We're going to end it here. Again, please do share this video if you know people who are more historically inclined and have an interest and an appetite for these types of videos. It is quite niche, especially in this community. So it would be incredible if the channel could reach these people. It would be greatly appreciated. And I'll catch you in the next one. Bye-bye. Hi. Put down the video at the end, listen.
Gotta put it in a video.